Good afternoon, and welcome to our second presentation in our Doing the Work series, Equity and Justice in Dallas, Past, Present, and Future. I'd like to remind everyone that we're recording this conversation. Good afternoon, and welcome to our second presentation in our Doing the Work series, Equity and Justice in Dallas, Past, Present, and Future. My name is Kenitra Brown, and I am the staff attorney at the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center, housed at the SMU Dedman School of Law. The Deason Center was established in the law school in July 2017 under the direction of Professor Pamela Metzger. The center brings a stats and stories approach to criminal justice reform. We use stats to emphasize the stories of lived experiences of justice-involved people to make compelling cases for criminal justice reform. We tell these stories through research, education, and advocacy. While our primary areas of research concern prosecutorial discretion, public defense, and small, tribal, and rural justice, our engagement agenda recognizes that we don't and can't do our work in a vacuum. And so it includes conversations about salient criminal justice issues in the national purview. Given the current climate and the impact on SMU law students, Erica Fidel, the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at SMU Law, and I curated this Doing the Work series to not only engage our students as future lawyers, but to include everyone in these important conversations. Lawyers are change makers. Everyone has a role to play in doing this work. To that end, the second panel, Equity and Justice in Dallas, was necessary to make sure our conversations are grounded in proximity and relevance. Dallas County is the 8th most populous county in the nation, and at the seat of the county, the city of Dallas is the 9th most populous city in the nation, while the DFW Metroplex is the 4th largest metropolitan area in the U.S. I mention these statistics because it's important to recognize that work concerning justice and equity in Dallas has national implications. The conversations have been happening for years. It's time to amplify them. Today, we present a dynamic panel to do just that. I'd like to introduce our wonderful moderator, Dr. Froswa Booker-Drew, who will then introduce our illustrious panel and get this conversation started. Dr. Froswa Booker-Drew is a network weaver who believes relationships are the key to our personal, professional, and organizational growth. She has been quoted in Forbes, Bustle, Huffington Post, and other media outlets. She has an extensive background in leadership, nonprofit management, partnership training, and education. She was formerly the National Community Engagement Director for World Vision and is currently the Vice President of Community Affairs and Strategic Partnerships for the State Fair of Texas. She's responsible for grant making, educational programming, and community initiatives. She's also the co-founder of Heritage Giving Circle, one of the first giving funds for Black American women in Texas, and she's the owner of Solstice Consultancy, LLC. Dr. Booker-Drew is the recipient of several honors, including the recent honor as a 2020 TED SMU speaker. She's an honoree for the 2019 Dallas Business Journal's Women in Business honoree. She's also been an honoree for the Global Big Heart 2014 and 2012 campaigns. She's won the Outstanding African American Alumni Award from the University of Texas at Arlington. She's won the 2009 Woman of the Year Award by Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, and she's been awarded the Diversity Ambassador for the American Red Cross. Dr. Froswa Booker-Drew graduated with a PhD from Antioch University in Leadership and Change with a focus on social capital, diverse women, and relational leadership. She's currently an adjunct professor at Tulane University and has been an adjunct professor at the University of North Texas at Dallas, the University of Texas at Arlington, and others. She's the author of 3 workbooks for women, and she currently remains a contributor for several global publications. With no further ado, I introduce to you Dr. Froswa Booker-Drew and the rest of our panel. Thank you.
The second installation of Equity and Justice in Dallas, Past, Present, and Future. This is going to be a dynamic panel, and I am looking forward to learning and introducing our panelists to you today. So Dr. Michael Phillips grew up in Garland, Texas, earning a journalism degree from the University of Texas at Arlington. For 7 years, he worked as a reporter at various newspapers, including the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He received his master's degree in history from the University of California at Riverside and a history doctorate from the University of Texas. He won UT's Best Dissertation Prize that year, and his work was published by the University of Texas Press in 2006 as White Metropolis, Race, Ethnicity, and Religion in Dallas, Texas, 1841 to 2001. The Texas Historical Commission gave White Metropolis its T.R. Fehrenbach Book Award for Best Book on Texas History in 2007. In 2019, Phillips joined the first group of scholars to win a community college faculty fellowship from the Mellon Foundation and the American Council of Learned Societies. That grant is funding research for a book he is currently writing with his wife, Betsy, on the history of the eugenics movement in Texas from 1854 to 1940. He lives in Plano with his wife and son, Dominique. Dr. Phillips, welcome and thank you for being here. Our next panelist is Kristian Steffany Hernandez. Born and raised in Dallas, Kristian is an organizer and daughter of Mexican immigrants. She was recently elected to the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, a role that puts her in the primary political leadership of the largest socialist organization in the U.S. Her home chapter, DSA North Texas, has been active in Dallas since 2016. Kristian has served as the chapter's co-chair from 2016 to 2018, and two of the most notable wins for the chapter have been a police oversight board, which has been an ongoing fight for years and was won with a robust coalition of various organizations, and paid sick time, which put Dallas as the first city in the South to win and implement this policy. She now serves on the Community Police Oversight Board representing District 6. She has a background in immigrant rights organizing, having served as a community outreach chair, two-term vice president, and now president for the local grassroots immigrant rights group, the North Texas Dream Team, which has been serving North Texas since 2010. The group has helped over 9,000 DACA recipients through the process with volunteers and pro bono attorneys that have saved an estimated $1 to $6 million in legal fees. Welcome, Kristian, to the panel. Our next panelist is Amber Sims, who currently serves as the Director of Regional Impact for Leadership Educational Equity, an educational nonprofit focused on leadership pathways and civic engagement. Before her current role, Amber led workforce development at Workforce Solutions Greater Dallas Opportunity Center. Her background includes work in racial equity, public relations, community advocacy, partnerships, and program expansion. Amber has served as a board member and chair of the Communications Committee for the South Dallas Fair Park Trust Fund, a grant and loan entity. She is a founding member of Young Leaders Strong City, a racial equity conference that empowers youth to organize and take action around dismantling racism. Amber is also a community member of the District 9 Committee for the Dallas Independent School District, a creator of the Race to Equity Conversation series, and has helped plan voter registration and voter rallies in Dallas. Amber has been published in both the Washington Post, Dallas Morning News, and Texas Monthly as an opinion columnist on issues such as fair GED testing and an equitable South Dallas. Welcome, Amber, to the panel. And then last but not least, Dr. Michael W. Waters. The Reverend Dr. Michael W. Waters is founder and lead pastor of the Abundant Life African Methodist Episcopal Church in Dallas, Texas, a pastor, professor, award-winning author, activist, and social commentator. Waters' words of hope and empowerment inspire national and international audiences. He has been on every show you can possibly imagine, such as ABC Nightline, BBC Newsnight, CBS, C-SPAN, MSNBC, and many more. His work has been featured or mentioned in the Associated Press, Chicago Tribune, Ebony Magazine, GQ, the Huffington Post, Newsweek, and even on CNN. He has earned a bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degree with honors from SMU in Dallas, and he has been invited to address such esteemed institutions such as the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and the United States House of Representatives. His accomplishments have been officially entered into the U.S. Congressional Record and are archived at the Library of Congress. He is the author of critically acclaimed national award-winning books, Freestyle Reflections on Faith, Family Justice, and Pop Culture, and Stakes Is High, Race, Faith, and Hope for America, winner of the prestigious National Wilbur Award in Nonfiction. His forthcoming children's books include For Beautiful Black Boys Who Believe in a Better World, and a fifth book titled Something in the Water, a 21st Century Civil Rights Odyssey, will be released in 2021. He is the recipient of many honors, including Peacemaker of the Year and the State Fair of Texas Juanita Craft Humanitarian Catalyst Community Builder Award. He is married to attorney Eulish Reeves Waters, who is the Deputy Director of the Lone Star Justice Allowance, and they are the proud parents of 3 children. So welcome to the panel. I am looking forward to learning from all of you. You have resumes that are out of this world, and we could just spend probably 3 days on each of you just going through all of your accomplishments. So thank you for what you do to build a better Dallas. So I'd like to start with Dr. Phillips. Dr. Phillips, would you provide a brief overview of the history of race, policing, and institutions in Dallas? And in addition to that, can you offer a national context of what is going on to set the tone for today's panel discussion?
Thank you for organizing this panel. And I want to say that we are in an extraordinary time. I was trying to think of an analogous time when there was a movement that was so broad-based geographically, so many people participating, and so durable, as we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter protests across the city, and so many issues that have been ignored for so long. The intrinsic racism in the American past, the icons we have in our landscape. It's really awe-inspiring, and the closest thing I can come to as an analogy is 1886, the Great Southwestern Railroad strike, where black and white workers struck against Jay Gould's railroads, but that had nowhere near the scope or the diversity or the durability. But I'm worried. I'm worried that one particular group of people are going to blow it. And to be blunt, I'm worried white people are going to blow it. They're going to miss the moment. One thing that gives me concern is I've noticed white people rushing to buy a particular book, and there's nothing wrong with the book, White Fragility. And this is a book authored by a corporate diversity consultant, and that automatically sets red flags for me. And what worries me is this, that this moment that has so much revolutionary potential will be diverted into a self-actualization project for a lot of middle-class white people and upper-class white people. In the book itself, there's nothing wrong with that. Journeys of self-redemption are essential. But corporate consultants aren't interested in addressing the fundamental social structures that create racism and reinforce it. And I think I certainly saw that in the history of Dallas. And I'll just note something. If you try to reduce racism to individual pathology and don't realize the reason it exists, where it comes from, and who benefits from it, then I think you're missing the point. And so in the history of racism, it's important to realize the genesis of that idea, the genesis of the idea of race, was actually tied to the birth of capitalism. I mean, Karl Marx wrote in Das Kapital, he's talked about how at the rosy-fingered dawn of capitalism, Europeans turned Africa into a game warden, hunting for black skins. This set off the age of exterminating Indians. And so the idea of race served to rationalize imperialism, colonization, and slavery. And that's how it's functioned in Dallas history. Dallas was built, and we finally are coming to terms with this. The Dallas economy was first built on slavery. And it served a couple of purposes. Number one, there were a lot of desperate whites living in Dallas at the time of slavery. And what slavery did is it depressed wages for whites. It extracted value from black bodies. Black people were robbed of their ownership of their own bodies. And it served to divide that working population. And this is a key to understanding how racism works. That white people get a compensation for racism, what W.E.B. Du Bois called the wages of whiteness. So in the slavery period, they knew the poorest, most disenfranchised whites, and there was widespread poverty in Texas in the period of slavery. They knew they couldn't be put on an auction block. They knew their children, their other loved ones couldn't be sold from them. And that was their wage, their white wage. Now, what dynamic changes with emancipation is this. Suddenly, after the abolition of slavery, the implementation of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, elite whites in Dallas, in the rest of Texas, and the rest of the South suddenly were concerned. How do you maintain the loyalty of whites to a system that in many ways does not benefit them? How do you restore, with the abolition of slavery and with African Americans getting legal rights that ostensibly makes them equal to, African Americans equal to white people? How do you give white people a sense of privilege and to feel like they're not sinking? Because white people are encouraged to think of society in terms of a zero-sum game. What's good for one group is bad for every other group. How do you ensure their loyalty? That's when you had the implementation of what we're talking about today. Jim Crow laws, poll taxes that disenfranchise African Americans. Those Jim Crow laws lead to and reinforce so much of the economic inequity. And it serves the purpose of racial propaganda, and it also frustrates the effort to overturn this system that causes so much misery for so many people. You know, one of the things that happens after slavery is the rise of the populist movement, which is another example where you had a or at least a biracial movement challenging the economic status quo. There were black populists, there were white populists challenging capitalism. And with the implementation of segregation, you have physical separation that makes political alliances much more difficult. And then that serves a propaganda purpose. White people can live in neighborhoods that black people can't. And then they make those neighborhoods overcrowded. City services aren't maintained. Crime is allowed to thrive. There's racism eventually in zoning. That's where you put liquor stores. That's where you put businesses like that. And there's environmental racism, something that exists to this day with Shingle Mountain in the southern sector of Dallas. White people see these neighborhoods. They associate African Americans and the Latinx community with pollution, with unpaved streets, whatever. It reinforces the sense we have privileges, and it's a warning. It tells white people, if you challenge the status quo, look what you could lose. Even the worst off white neighborhood is perceived as being better than the best off black neighborhood. So, and it shatters any possibility of solidarity. And here's one other thing about the concept of white fragility. I think it misses another dimension, and then I'll finish. What is missed is what we call white is built on a series of absences. And I think that's the real dynamic of whiteness, that there is no scientific basis for white identity. First Europeans were black. We're talking about a series of random mutations that produce the traits that are called white. But what we consider white today wasn't always considered white in the past. There are millions of people who belonged to groups in the 19th century, Italians, Jewish Americans, etc., who weren't white in the 19th century. And that's the key to social control, and that's the thing that we're missing, that racism ultimately is about social control for everyone, and that whiteness gained can be whiteness lost. And that's what causes people to invest in a system that ultimately, fundamentally, is a loss for them. The possibility of alliances for a much better life for everyone. So this is a dynamic throughout. Dallas history, the slipperiness of white identity, and this is what provides social control and divides people and diverts people from a shared class identity.
Dr. Phillips, thank you for providing the historical context and really helping our audience to understand systemic racism and how far it has gone back in the ties between capitalism and what we see today. And so I want to open it up to our panelists to talk about their own personal experiences as we talk about systemic racism and issues such as policing and talking about equity. Could you all elaborate on your experiences as a person of color in these spaces? Because I think it's important for folks to understand not only this historical context, but also making it personal.
Absolutely. I'll be delighted to begin. And first, let me thank you for creating this space and the opportunity to share alongside such tremendous justice warriors. And I am honored and grateful for the work that you do in the world. The three experiences that come to mind readily. One, I actually included in my first book, Freestyle, Reflections on Faith, Family, Justice, and Pop Culture. It happened to be a July 4th, and we were taking our family out to see the fireworks. I was driving the lead vehicle. My now deceased uncle was beside me. Behind me was my 3-year-old son at the time and his godfather. And we were riding down Ledbetter, and a DPD officer pulled alongside us and then dropped behind us and turned the lights on and pulled us over. I looked immediately down at the speedometer and recognized that I was actually traveling under the speed limit, so that couldn't have been the concern. There were no other infractions on my part. And when the officer came to the window, he asked me a very peculiar question. The question he asked me was, what do I do for a living? As we put things together, I came to recognize I was actually riding or driving my wife's vehicle. And on the back, there was a decal that at the time said SMU Law. And somehow that officer looked at these 3 black men and a black boy riding his vehicle and had made the determination that the vehicle must have been stolen. That's one experience. Another experience was serving as pastor in South Dallas. And unfortunately, a gentleman had been shot a few blocks up and had come towards our empowerment center at the time and had collapsed, and we called officers to come there. And I was having a conversation as they tended to him and were looking at the scene with one of the officers who was there. And he informed me, stated very matter of fact, I still can't believe we had this conversation, but he let me know that their beat was given more to the protection of properties in South Dallas than the people of South Dallas. And to hear him say that just matter of factly, that we do what we do to make sure that people's properties are not harmed. If you know anything about South Dallas, you know that only 20% of South Dallas is owned by the residents of South Dallas. He was in essence saying that we're not here for the people of our community, but we are here for those who are the landowners in this space. And then a final experience that I'll never forget, recently having earned a doctorate from SMU, riding with my family down Ross Avenue, my wife and our children. Matter of fact, we had a newborn because I had just received that doctorate. Another incident where a police officer pulls up beside me, drops to the back, and pulls us over. I'm not riding in anything extravagant. This is a minivan with children, about the most innocent thing you could imagine. And yet he still found cause to pull us over and, of course, shone the light in the back seat in the faces of our children who were terrified, and let us go without cause. But it brought to mind the very clear reality that there is a persecution of pigmentation and the criminality of color in our nation, and that there's no level of achievement, no level of degree holding status that you can earn in this nation. Not that that should be the way it goes, but just to state it matter of factly, that can shield you from this harm. And we've seen this perpetuated all over the nation. But those are 3 experiences that I want to lift up at this time.
And Dr. Waters, I appreciate you bringing that up, because for some people it's the belief of, if you just do respectability politics and you just say the right things, do the right things, it will stop that from happening. And we know that not to be true at all. That with PhDs and with, you know, some level of accomplishment, that it does not preclude you from having these experiences in our world. So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else on the panel would like to share their personal experiences? Amber.
Yeah, first, well, thank you for the question. I am was born in Dallas. My dad is from Birmingham, Alabama. And I always give that context because we spent time living in Birmingham and then would go there every summer. And one of the things, you know, as an adult that I really think back on is the very rich history of Birmingham as to bear witness as to what happened in the civil rights movement. You know, there is a whole civil rights museum. There are statues dedicated to the civil rights movement. And also we learn about it in our history books. The thing that I'll offer, the context that Dr. Phillips offered, is that we do not learn about Dallas, Texas in our history books. And so Dallas is a very ahistorical place, right? If you were not careful, you would think that it was a race neutral place, and it's a very racist place. That is no different from Birmingham. That has just done a very good job of cleaning itself up and dressing itself up year after year. And so as an adult, I really had to go back and unlearn what I had learned about my city. I had to look at it with interrogating eyes. And I had to rethink, and this is something, you know, that I especially, you know, want to say to folks who are from different places of the country, you know, especially up north, that racism exists everywhere. It is not a North thing, it is not a South thing, it is an American thing, and it is deeply embedded into how we experience the world. And so if you think about, you know, and I want you all to think very strongly about what this does to kids, you know, as someone who works in education, is that if you are not learning about your history, you are learning about someone else's history, right? I was learning about someone else's history. And luckily I had the advantage, right, of literally having family who lived through the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama. But if I had grown up in Dallas, Texas, and I fear this a lot in the work that I do with our students here, is if you grow up here, you are not learning the history of Dallas, Texas. And that is something that we have to take responsibility of as adults, and we have to really think about how are we going to intentionally teach students something different. And so, you know, we lived in Pleasant Grove initially and then moved to Mesquite. And I remember having very vivid experiences, right, of being called the N-word walking home from school with friends. I remember, you know, learning about Africa and someone calling the Niger River the Nigger River. You know, I remember, you know, being told that I'd be an ideal person to date if I wasn't Black, right? And so, you know, all of these things that we are doing that harm Black and brown children and children of color, and also my offer, it harms white people too, right? It is just that white people also benefit. But, you know, we can't underestimate what is being taken away from us that we get to get back, right? If we learn our history and if we have conversations, if we are very honest, right, about what has taken place. And what we have to unlearn and the work that we have to do and the collective liberation that is at the end, right, of this work is the reward. It's not this stuff, right? It's not the benefits of capitalism. It is the things that we get to get back because of what we've lost in terms of our history and the stories that are lost and the lies that are told that we have to continue to tell year after year.
You know, and Amber, the thing that you bring up is it's not only the systemic racism that we deal with, but it's the microaggressions. Those things that are said that people believe aren't necessarily being racist. So dealing with it both from that context as well as from this larger community context can be exhausting. So I want to ask Dr. Waters, Kristian, if you want to chime in, please do so, because we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I definitely would. Thank you so much for having me. And I apologize, my puppies are making a lot of noise in the background. But I think much of my generalized feelings of not feeling safe around the police have always existed. You know, born and raised in Dallas. But as I've gotten older, I've also become more aware of how we use police as a way to quote unquote solve our problems. You know, I'd see unhoused people getting harassed or ticketed, people with no place to go, getting kicked out of our libraries, out of Parkland, cops working with ICE to detain immigrants, as the large majority of deportations occur through police interactions. And I also, as I became more and more involved with other groups and sort of the organizing work that's really required to enable change here in this city and in this country, I also saw how often cops were on the side of those in power, how often cops were protecting capital and not people. Cops protected Kelsey Warren of Clyde Warren fame's pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. Cops came after UAW workers when they went on strike last year in nearby Arlington. Cops came after my friends who were protesting the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Cops enforced the juvenile curfews that disproportionately impact Latino youth in my district. And so it took a while for me to come to the realization that as a society, we've accepted this idea that we can police our way out of inequity, when in actuality, policing enables inequity. We can't really have true equity without addressing racial capitalism, which is inherently anti-democratic, anti-Black, reliant on the disposability and poverty of people, and is largely upheld by policing as an institution. And in Dallas in particular, home to many millionaires and billionaires whose wealth relies on the exploitation of the working class. And Dallas, again, once home to the largest KKK clan in the country, those influences and material interests don't just go away, they become entrenched.
Kristian, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's so important for people to understand the historical context, and you brought that up. I don't think people understand the history even of policing and how it started out of slavery with patty rollers. And so it's important for us to have this context so that we can see how it impacts what's going on today. So thank you for sharing your experiences as well. Dr. Waters, I want to ask you a question about the role of the faith community, because as a pastor, and you've mentioned that you've seen a lot of things and had a lot of experiences. What's been the role of the faith community in Dallas regarding social justice? And are there opportunities for involvement from the church? And what would that look like?
I appreciate the question, and I want to build off of Kristian's statements and offering my own. I believe that if we want to provide the clearest image of what Dallas has been in the history we are fighting to get away from, it is that of the Klan. I'm holding the 1920s era authentic Klan mask. And we must recognize that this hood is the greatest representation of our city, okay? That we did not accidentally stumble to become the city with the highest number of Klanspersons, the largest chapter in America. Here's a card from a W.E. Cole, Dallas, Texas, KKK card-carrying member, dues-paying member from 1934. And at one point in our city's history, 1/3 of all white men were card-carrying members of this organization. They are the ones who drew in the colors for the red line of the city. And we still have monuments and roads named in their celebration. Not to mention R.L. Thornton Freeway, our longtime mayor and grand wizard of the KKK. Now let's talk about the role of the church. The picture behind me was taken in 1951 after yet another bombing took place in South Dallas. As they interrogated this particular bombing and one that also occurred in May of 1950, they discovered that complicit in the bombing event was the white church in Dallas. White churches and white neighborhood groups that were enacting harm upon Black people. Now that's horrific enough. We know that the KKK and other organizations have this pseudo-Christianity, this white supremacy that seeks to present itself as Christian. That's a part of our history. The greater stain upon the city of Dallas is how the Black church became complicit in providing cover for this harm. And that's something we must speak to as well, is that the Black church, in many ways, at least some portions, some notable portions of the Black church, were creating the harm that was perpetuated against the Black community. And that's something we must acknowledge. I don't know of any other municipality in the United States of America where the white business establishment has so infiltrated, in particular the Black church, that the Black church was used to quail, or at least to attempt to quail, the uprisings that were happening within this city. All right, so that's a part of our history. And we can extend that conversation all the way to the birth of the moral majority and the connections to Christian conservatism that still have deep roots in this city, where we continue to endorse white supremacy on its highest level, even in the White House of the United States of America. That's our legacy. Now, we are in a reformation moment, a reconstruction moment that's really being centered around interfaith or multi-faith collaboration, which is exciting and is uplifting. There are people who have been harmed, who have found each other over the last 6 or 7 years, and in finding each other, have formed coalitions to support grassroots movement in this city. There are a number of organizations that I can list, quite a few, that have been birthed in this time and whose work I appreciate. Faith in Texas is one such organization. I had the privilege for a number of years of serving alongside Imam Omar Suleiman and Rabbi Nancy Casson as co-chairs of Faith Forward Dallas. That's another organization. I'm grateful to be a part of a brand new movement birthed within the Black church, the Black clergy agenda, that has sought to be a part of this work. So while we have this very troubled history, we are in the midst of an exciting time. And I think what's most exciting for me about this moment is you have faithful people who are willing to come to the table without the necessity of controlling the table. And that's so problematic in so many places across our nation, where religious people, Christian folk, Jewish folk, Muslim folk who are in leadership feel like they have to control every table. You have individuals who've been willing to stand in solidarity and to really highlight the work of the grassroots organizers who are really pushing movement forward, and to add whatever voice and strength we can add to the movements that they are attending. So that's really my consideration of our history, a history that is deep-seated in white supremacy, where in fact the church was an enactor of white supremacist functions upon our city. But now we're in a revolutionary time, a reconstruction period, where we see a lot of hopeful things happening. And it is my prayer that it will continue.
Thank you, Dr. Waters. I appreciate that. I don't think people recognize even the history as we talk about Dallas, when Martin Luther King came to Dallas. And there were pastors, Black pastors, who would not allow him to be in their pulpit because of fear of what would happen from other pastors and the retribution that would come. And so it's so important for us to understand the role of the faith community in all of this, because it plays a significant role. Even in our chat box, we have folks calling out some folks in our area who are very, very interesting. And so let's move on. I appreciate your comments. Ms. Hernandez, Kristian, I want to talk to you about, because you're on the DPD Oversight Board, which was designed to ensure civilian complaints and review impartially to enhance the transparency and trust between the city of Dallas, the Dallas Police Department, and the community. What's being done now, and what are the issues that the board will address this year, and how will you all measure your success?
Yeah, well, I'd like to start by clarifying that the mission of the Community Police Oversight Board is actually to ensure that Dallas residents can trust that complaints of misconduct by DPD are thorough, fair, accessible, and transparent. So it's completely up to the city and to DPD to build trust between those institutions and Dallas residents. We're here for the community. At the start of our term, we called for an independent investigation into the death of Diamond Ross, and we've been diligently reviewing complaints submitted to our oversight board, both now that we have a monitor in place, Monitor McClary, but also that we've been able to meet. We were, out of commission for a couple months due to COVID, and we really pushed for us to be able to meet, especially our oversight board chair, because I think it's important, and policing doesn't stop just because there's a pandemic going on. And so those complaints will include the ones submitted by protesters, given the incident that happened on the bridge shortly after the public lynching of George Floyd. As a result of that incident, we've also called for a review of DPD's use of force and protest policies. We're also working on setting up subcommittees that will include non-board members, so members of the community, to procure further involvement by community members in the work of the board. And it's hard to say exactly what issues we'll be dealing with as a board, as the bulk of the work will unfortunately fall on whatever complaints we receive and any egregious actions on behalf of DPD. But I am seeing a commitment to reviewing existing policies, as well as ascertaining whether there are recommendations that can be made to better ensure the safety of all those who live, work, and play in Dallas. And I'm not sure that our success can be measured in any specific way, or rather in a way that will feel like success. At the end of the day, we exist because DPD continues to need oversight. And that need for oversight translates into harm inflicted on members of the public that DPD has sworn to protect and serve. I suppose the only way to really gauge success is as to whether Dallas residents trust that we're doing all we can to make sure DPD is living up to their own policies.
Thank you, Kristian. Ms. Sims, the inequities in education in Dallas are significant for both Black and Brown youth. In your work, how are you addressing this issue? And what are the historical implications of for our students today? And what's the impact on them, especially in light of COVID and what is going on, as we see in South Dallas with technology and some of the other issues that our students are experiencing? Talk about your experiences in that space.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that was very important for me, you all, to do when I started my role with Lee, we work with educators and former educators in DFW throughout the Metroplex, was to do a history of race and education in DFW. And, you know, doing that research, and this is something that we know, but we don't know, right? I would offer is that Dallas, all Texas schools started off segregation, right? Segregation was written into state laws, and it called for a separation of white and colored students, right, or Negro, as Black folks were called back then. And when Dallas ISD was created, right, it was created as a segregated district. I would also like to offer that we talk about Dallas ISD in our schools today as desegregated, and yet that is not the way that most Black and Brown students experience school. They do not experience schools as desegregated. Most Black kids and Brown kids are going to school with other Black and Brown kids and not white kids. And, you know, the handful of white students in terms of percentage, right, that are going to Dallas ISD schools are going to a few select, talented and gifted magnet schools that require special admissions and all of that, right? And that is just very important because the resource, and some of them are coming from out of district, right? And so the resources, you know, that Dallas ISD is getting are not going to our students. But then I also, right, want to you all to think about that because Dallas ISD was created as a segregated entity, the resources were not there. And so when we think about Brown versus Board of Education, Black families were suing and had been, right, fighting and advocating, and we should throw in, right, that Hispanic families as well had been fighting for equitable and equal resources in their separate entities. And what they got versus what they asked for are worlds apart, even today. And, you know, just some important dates that I, you know, want to remind you all is that 1930 was the first and only year that Mexican appeared as a race on the census. And after that time period, right, with its Mexican American, you know, on the whole population expanding, Dallas ISD then began to segregate Mexican students in a way that it had not previous to 1940, right? And so there were not real race distinctions for Hispanic students except for based on language, right? And so Dallas ISD was murky. It was definitely created as a Black and white system, right? And because race is a construct and because race is fluid, who gets to enter and be classified as white is fluid, even though, you know, Hispanic and Latinx and all of that isn't a race. But white, you know, and if you're Hispanic and Latinx, you're technically classified as white. And I think Kristian can tell you, baby, she is not experiencing the world as a white person. And so, you know, I'll let her speak on that, but just some other dates, right, is we still have in 1970 that Sam Tasby had to sue Dallas ISD, right, because his kids still weren't allowed equitable resources, that Dallas ISD fought to have what they called stair-step desegregation. They wanted it to take as long as 8 to 12 years, right? And so this place resisted desegregation as long as it possibly could, and wasn't taking off deseg orders until 2013, 2014. Garland ISD is still on these deseg orders, and I would offer that Dallas ISD should be too, because schools are not desegregated, resources are not allocated equally. And right, our students are still being policed, right? The work that Kristian and others are doing for Dallas Police Department needs to be done for DISD Police Department. Dallas ISD has a fully functioning police department that has a $17 million budget that is being written into the ISD's bond proposal. And you know, the other thing that I'll say is, even in the conversation of where we are having explicit conversations about race, Dallas ISD is talking about cultural competency. They are, you know, putting strategies in place to address cultural competency and not racial inequity. And that's a problem, right? If our largest ISD system, which really directs the way for how other school districts are going to go, doesn't have a clear way and a definitive way to be race explicit, we got a problem. And, you know, I just want to point that out, because also, what is our role as citizens, right, to hold the district accountable, to say, we want race explicit training, right? We want to reduce the budget of the police force. We want Black and brown students to have equitable students. We demand, and for those things to happen.
If I can just speak up for a second. I'm sitting in Plano, Texas, and I think this is a part of the story that of integration, segregation in area history that's overlooked. Yeah, I'm in a quote unquote suburb that is a product of white flight. And so very often when people are taught about the civil rights movement, they're taught about legislation. The resistance is depicted, you know, as Bull Connor, you know, using fire hoses, you know, Black protesters, you know, very bravely, you know, trying to integrate stores, etc. The sad story is that much of the civil rights movement, of course, was undermined through the process of white flight. And the capital that flowed out of Dallas because of that, even though those suburbs benefit financially from attachment to the name Dallas. And it's a colonial relationship that not just the outer suburbs, but in burbs like Highland Park. It's a process of domestic colonization, exploitation of Dallas resources, exploitation of the name. And I think that story is untold. One thing, you know, last spring I was at a panel discussion, and it was at the University of Texas at Dallas, which is in Richardson. And I think that that is a really striking example of theft, theft of a name, and abandonment of the Black and brown population in Dallas. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Kristian, Amber had referenced you, and there's a question in the chat box that I want to bring up that someone asked about as well, and it said to ask about the intersectionality of immigrant rights and Black rights, because you've done a lot of work in this space. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe there's any kind of liberation without Black liberation. So, you know, we could start there. But really, like, our immigration policies affect Black immigrants, and I think this is often erased from the national narrative. I think, especially in Texas, you know, we often think, when we think of immigrants, we think of people from Mexico, and largely erase people from, you know, from African countries, from Central America. And we're also seeing, you know, more and more immigrants coming in from places like India. I think when, you know, the Allen raid happened a couple of years ago, it was one of the largest raids in the most recent decade. There were a large number of Ethiopian immigrants that were, you know, caught up in that raid. And, you know, as as Black people. I think that's really important. At the border, African migrants often face a lot of racism. There's a lot of anti-Blackness within the Latinx community, and also being subject to state-sanctioned violence at the border. I do think that detention and incarceration are two sides of the same coin. They're both profit-driven systems that earn money by filling beds. And I think even going on to the point of like a lot of immigrants in Texas don't have health care, right? And so I think that's also another thing, because we are seeing that Texas is the most uninsured and underinsured state in this country. How high Black maternal death rates are, how many people are disproportionately impacted by COVID, particularly Black and brown people in this country. And so I think like when we're thinking about the way that the systems really come together and are really motivated by the disposability of Black and brown people, often because immigrants are subjected to no rights when it comes to wages, particularly if they're undocumented. And I think we saw that little bit of that when the hurricane hit in Houston, and people were trying to sort of rebuild, but really had no protection for ensuring that they could actually earn those wages. And so I think like that's where that intersection really lies for me, is that when we talk about especially in this moment of uprising, right, that where we're seeing a really huge fight for Black lives and very, very much justified rage. The uprising in the context of, say, the Supreme Court ruling on DACA, I think that there would be no way that we would have gotten a favorable ruling had the uprisings not really scared the ruling class into ruling in favor of DACA recipients for the time being. And I think that's like the biggest fear of the people that are currently in power in this country, is that there is a realization, as Dr. Phillips was talking about, that our liberation is tied to each other's, and that white people, poor working class white people, are also being oppressed under the claws of capitalism. And so the sooner that like people understand and are able to yield that privilege and really come together as people and understand that collective liberation, I mean, there's hell to pay there.
Y'all are this is good. I wish we had another hour to just continue to delve into these topics. Someone put in the chat box, this is a brain trust. And it is so much brilliance on this panel. And so I know that we're coming to a close in our time, and I had more questions. And one of the questions I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to go to the chat box, is this month is the 4-year anniversary of the protests that happened. And so as you reflect on this current context, how should the city move forward? And what are some of the priorities that the city should have as it relates to policing and education and immigration and the faith community? And as Dr. Phillips even mentioned, white folks and their fragility. What should be, with looking at all of those things, what should be the priorities moving forward for the city of Dallas?
One of the things, so looking at TEA data that gives us data about how students are performing academically, but then also how students are policed within their classrooms, is that if you look at the data, you all, and this is something that I really want everyone to know, is that Black students, despite only making up about 25% of Dallas ISD's population, are over suspended and have a higher number of out of school suspensions than brown students, than white students. And so the number is 6,000, and the number of Hispanic students, for an example, is about 4,500, right? And it just makes us know that students are being policed in schools. And we have to be very, very concerned. And so I want to bring student voice into this conversation, because we were having a conversation with the police chief from Dallas ISD, and there was a student on the call, and she told him that having police in schools does not make her feel safe. And we as adults don't make students feel safe, right? Because everybody on the call kind of breezed past that and kept going. And yet we have to really think about and highlight the experiences of anti-Blackness, right? Of anti-immigration, of our students that are LGBTQ not fully being able to feel represented, right, in the schools in which they attend and are policed by their dress code and how they look and how they act and in between classes and all of these different things that continue to strip away our humanity. And, you know, also knowing that there are tons of policies, right, that police students every single day. And then how are we complicit in the dehumanizing of students? And how do we want to respond differently? And so that's why I really talk about trainings, right? Because the things that we view become how we act, right? And also how we spend our budgets and how the school district even is prioritizing its budget is a direct reflection of the experience that students are going to have, right? And so I don't want the experience that I had to ever be replicated, right? Of racism and inequities and being underfunded as a Black student in this, you know, in this system, but we will be. And so I just want us to be very intentional about who we think gets to have voice, how we listen to students, how we show up. And then for everyone on this panel is, you know, how we shift, you know, our priorities. And this is something that Dr. Booker-Drew has been working on from these huge nonprofits, right, that get this money and the resource allocation to smaller Black, American Indian led, you know, Latinx led, LGBTQ led organizations that are doing the work on shoestring budgets, y'all. We make magic happen with nothing. And it shouldn't be like that. You know, we should not, you know, having done the work, I know one of the organization I work with has served over 2,000 students teaching them about race and organizing. And I know we haven't received more than $75,000 over 6 years to do the work.
So Kenitra, the next panel is on nonprofits and foundations in Dallas.
And I'll stop there.
Anyone else? Please share.
I think we have to recognize that the history of Dallas is a history of horrors, and that it extends from the time that indigenous people were slaughtered upon what we currently know the Trinity River, through the legacy of the Confederacy and the Klan, through the quelling of the uprising of the Civil Rights Movement, to the era of police brutality. We don't talk about this, but in the early 70s, Black leaders went to City Hall to meet with city officials because over 20 Black people had been shot and killed in our city in the early 70s. The death of Santos Rodriguez, which would not have happened had the officer that killed Michael Moorhead a year prior been dealt with appropriately, except when he killed that young Black man, he was simply moved to serve an area where then he killed a young Latino man. To the point that during the 1980s, the city of Dallas led the nation in terms of police brutality, so much so that a congressional hearing on the matter was housed here in the city. To the fact that since 1990, we have increased our racialized communities of poverty from 18 to 36, and that there's no other city in America with more racialized communities of poverty than the city of Dallas, a city of horrors. We're at the bottom of just about every horrible list you can be in America, including the Urban Institute's report in 2018, which found the city of Dallas to be 274th out of 274 American cities in terms of racial inequity and racial segregation. A nation leader in childhood poverty, a nation leader in single household renters, which is a part of the ongoing legacy of redlining. The fact that we live in a city where Black people make up just 20% of the population, but over 50% of the rest in accounting that leads the nation in terms of uninsured workers. Every single horror that you can imagine is rooted right here in the city of Dallas, except we are very deft in our ability to refashion our history and present ourselves to the world as clean and pristine. We have an entire nation, an entire city south of I-30, a population or a landmass larger than Atlanta, larger than Seattle and Denver combined. And it is a community that has suffered from functional white supremacy for far too long. The question is, when will Dallas have the courage to look ourselves in the mirror and to see ourselves for who we really are? It's very problematic in terms of the harm. And the persons being the greatest harmed are the children. Right there in South Dallas at the MLK Learning Center, a school named for one of our great Americans, a third of those students are homeless. Now add to all of these harmful realities, COVID-19. A series of horrors that have been acted. And I want to say in wrapping up here that what we must acknowledge is all of these brutalities and atrocities were done intentionally. These are not unintentional harms, right? When through eminent domain, what happened in the State Fair of Texas in the 1966, I think for real is really probably the clearest picture of the way Dallas is operating. And some of you don't know the story. Others of you do, so I'll share it. The story that white fairgoers were terrified by the Black poverty that they saw surrounding the state fair. And so the solution was not to empower or to sow resources in the community surrounding, but to remove individuals from their property, build an island around the state fair so that individuals going to enjoy themselves at the fair would not be troubled by the suffering of others created in the image of God. I mean, that is a horrible history. And it's something that we're still living through today. And so again, it is imperative at this moment that we stop hiding behind the Dallas Cowboys, stop hiding behind the TV show Dallas, stop hiding behind the fact that we have this arts district and this business district when there are persons who are being left behind. And we have to have the courage to do something. And the something that we can do is we can, in fact, defund the police. That is something that we must do and something that we can do, something I believe we're called to do. Let's acknowledge that the failed experiment of America is Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was halted by white supremacy. We can begin the work of Reconstruction once again through reappropriating monies to impacted communities to bring about the type of change that can come through this investment. My prayer is that we not get swayed by rhetoric and by persons who are suggesting that we cannot recreate our world in the ways that we must, that fear mongers who are trying to tell us that our world will break out instantaneously into riots and all kind of other evils if in fact, instead of overfunding a department, we actually put monies in the hands of individuals who can feed children and make sure the individuals who need mental health care have that ability. I think we must hold the line and see this through. The great horror of America is that we've only made progress usually because of the dramatic shedding of blood, because people have died. And there may be no greater honor to all the persons who have been harmed, not only here in Dallas, but across our nation, than to finally do this work and to redirect these funds in ways that they're needed.
Thank you, Dr. Waters. One of the questions that has come up throughout the chat box and on the Q&A has been this thread about what do we do? And what are the next steps that people can take? One of the questions says, do you think we should adopt the language of abolition of these oppressive systems instead of reforming these oppressive systems? And how do you see liberation becoming a reality? And so there's this common thread of what do we do now? And so Amber, you've alluded to some things around education and what we can do. Dr. Waters, you talked about defunding the police. What is it that individuals who are on this call can do today to begin this process? Dr. Phillips.
I just want to make a note referring to something Dr. Waters said. One of the things that was fascinating for me when I started my dissertation was my dissertation committee, when they read my final product that became White Metropolises, they said, Dallas isn't that bad, really, was it? And then when I got to Dallas, people said, yeah, it is that bad. You know, Dallas has been very successful at whitewashing its history. But to get to your point. This is an abstract goal, but I think it has practical applications. There's a historian named George Lipschitz who referred to the possessive investment in whiteness. We have to disinvest in whiteness. White people do. There are material benefits to the racial ideology we have, but in the end, I think it's an irony that there's very same people who say all lives matter. Really, when it comes to the financial bottom line, no lives matter. And we're seeing this now. You know, when it was African American workers, restaurants or other work sites who were dying overwhelmingly from COVID. All of a sudden, there was a movement to reopen. Now, all of a sudden, we're discovering that our racial identity and our so-called middle-class identity isn't a magic shield. I find it striking that at SMU, there was a petition circulating. These professors who invested so heavily in their PhDs to enter, the middle class, all of a sudden are being told, you're going to go to a classroom and during a pandemic. And here's something we share. We're mortal. And that virus doesn't care if we're white or black. And so we have the illusion of whiteness, but we also have this fiction called the middle class that is yanked from us when it serves the interests of the ruling class. Those professors have things in common with those Uber drivers that they didn't imagine. And so we have to really re-examine where we fit. And there are two classes in America: people who cut the checks, people who make the decisions, and people have to comply with those decisions. And if we can rededicate ourselves to a revolutionary politics that considers race and class simultaneously, I think we rebuild the country.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
I mean, I want to, sort of take a moment also, your question earlier about, the July 2016 protests. That was actually the first protest I'd ever gone out to around police brutality. We were out there to protest the murder of Alton Sterling, who was targeted not only because of his skin color, but because of his size, and Philando Castile, who I was astounded to learn that Castile had been stopped by the police 50 times in 13 years, which is just if everyone can sort of take a mental note of how many times they've been stopped by the police and wonder if that's, anywhere even near that number. And I think that protest actually, and the shootings that followed really unveiled Dallas. The city seemed to buckle down to a view of back the blue, and ignored the reason why people were in the streets and why people have stayed in the streets in the first place. The fact that the aftermath was the first time in the US a bomb had been used to kill a suspect should have been more of a focal point. It signaled to me that DPD was ready to do whatever it took to protect their own. And then that was given that Botham Jean also was classified as a perfect victim, years later, in the context that Black people often die twice, once at the hands of the police and again in the arms of the media that work hard to kill their character. But I think, even guilty people don't deserve death at the hands of the police. And these events all together really indicated to me what the city would and wouldn't put up with, as well as the role of the DPA, the Dallas Police Association, the police union, that they play in protecting their officers from accountability. I think city priorities should be ensuring that the DPA does not have a role in our local politics, and also should take a close look at what problems we're asking policing to solve, and whether we can root our solutions in care instead. We need defunding, we need demilitarization of our police department, and we need a recommitment to the well-being of Dallas residents. And not just that, but moving away from policing as a practice, surveillance, punishment, oppression. To me, defunding and further down the line, abolition is a politics of abundance versus a politics of austerity. It's about creating a world that's already possible. I think for people who really are looking at getting involved, I think making sure that you're not just looking for individual solutions, because collective solutions are always better. I'm part of a group called Our City, Our Future, and we're currently working around the city budget that's coming up. Again, 60% of our city budget goes to the police, and to think about the number of things we could do with that money instead is astounding. And so we're currently doing program, an ambassador program, where people can have vision sessions with their neighbors, with their friends, with their family in the city of Dallas, and can talk about like what are things we would rather fund with this money. And then we're going to present a people's budget, a budget that's rooted in like what people need to feel safe and what people need to feel cared for. Actually having a say, having a democracy, a local democracy, I think is just one of the ways that people can get involved and really see the way that local politics actually does have a huge impact on the everyday lives of people in the city.
Kristian, thank you. I am cracking up with the comments in the chat box. Someone told you, Kristian, they're going to throw their damn computer, go off. And so thank you all for making folks lit today to do something different in our city. And I appreciate each and every one of you because you are making a difference. And today just proves that there is light at the end of the tunnel because we have each of you and you're doing amazing work to make a difference. Any final thoughts in the last 2 minutes that you'd like to share with the audience before we turn this off and go back to making things happen?
Well, again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be a part and to be with this esteemed panel, and thank you for your moderation. I wanted to say very quickly, I had the opportunity to write the foreword to a new book entitled Good White Racist, Confronting Your Role in Racial Injustice. And I want to commend this to anyone who's watching, in particular for this reason. Dr. King said that persons, particularly white people who are working on race equity, those who are moderates in the middle, while they were troubled by what they considered to be hostilities against Black bodies, they were not committed to equity of same bodies. So while they did not want to see those bodies lynched, they also didn't want to see those bodies living next door to them. And I think this is the time for us to really reimagine who we are as a city. You can't talk about justice and wanting to make Dallas a new place if you operate from the same mentality, that you're troubled by seeing someone lynched or someone with a knee on their neck, but you're not troubled by seeing them not allowed to move into your neighborhood or their children not to have the same opportunities that your children have. We have to confront that evil within ourselves. And if we do so, we can make Dallas a much better place. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say continue to, to hear from voices like this. And then, if you have a certain, few group of Black and brown people that you call on, expand that list, but not at the expense of them, right? And so, if you are going to have people come in and speak to your group, and especially your white group, about what's happening, remember the rules of compensation, right? That people deserve to be compensated for their time and labor and brilliance, and not only compensated, but also cited. As a Black woman, I've seen my words end up somewhere else and I am never mentioned. And so I just, want to continue to invite people and bring people into the conversations around compensation of this work, and also the value of it. And then in addition, investing in this work, right? Investing in Kristian's organization, investing in Young Leaders Strong City and the IF Institute, and bringing folks into the table and not taking up these contracts, that are now going to DEI service providers. We've seen white folks that are in this space that are monetarily benefiting from work that Black and people of color have done, and it has to stop. And then going into your organizations and looking at policies that impact Black and brown people. And saying, like, why are Black and brown people not in these spaces? Why are people of color not in these spaces? Why are LGBTQ people not in these spaces? And really taking a look at the policies and just crossing stuff out that makes it impossible for people to ever get into your organization and be able to not even have a seat at the table, but to reimagine the world in which they want it to be. And so we do a lot of, the police does a lot of policing, but we culturally do a lot of policing, within our communities and organizations that we've got to check, and we've got to disrupt, and we've got to dismantle and replace it with everyone having collective access.
Thank you all so much for a wonderful conversation, for so much insight. Just to be able to be a part of your brilliance has just been amazing for me, and I'm sure it has been for our audience because of the number of comments. And so thank you all for what you do and what you're doing to make our city better. I'm going to turn it back over to Kenitra if she has any last words. But again, thank you all for the opportunity to be here. And I am just so grateful to know that we're going to be okay. Or in the words of Kendrick Lamar, we're going to be all right. Thank y'all.